Here's the phrase that should get your attention. Minimal notice. That's not Weather Channel drama. It's the actual working assessment from AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert about a stretch of ocean sitting right off the U.S. East Coast, close enough to land that if something spins up there may not be much warning before it does. And that's just one piece of what forecasters are tracking over the next 10 days. Flash flooding is already unfolding in New England as this video goes up. A line of severe storms with damaging winds is sweeping from the Midwest into the east. In a heat pattern that NOAA says favors the southeast, the mid-Atlantic and parts of the northeast is building right behind it. None of these are separate stories. They're one connected pattern, and here's exactly what's in it day by day. It's worth saying up front that this isn't a single storm chasing headlines the way a hurricane with a name does. It's something arguably trickier to communicate and trickier to prepare for. 4 distinct hazards: flooding, wind, heat, and a tropical watch zone, stacking into the same 10-day stretch, each moving on its own timeline, each requiring its own kind of attention. That's exactly the kind of pattern that tends to catch people off guard, not because any single piece of it is unprecedented, but because it's easy to tune out one alert while another one is quietly building right behind it. Let's start with what's actively unfolding, because part of this 10-day window is already underway. A deepening area of low pressure has been slowly tracking along the New England coast, and it's been pulling in an unusually large amount of atmospheric moisture. The National Weather Service's Weather Prediction Center placed a moderate risk, level 3 out of 4 on the excessive rainfall scale, over portions of southeastern New York, northwestern Connecticut, western Massachusetts, and southern Vermont. That's a serious designation. It means forecasters aren't just expecting heavy rain, they're expecting rain heavy enough, falling fast enough, to produce significant flash flooding, and it's arriving on ground that, in some spots, is already saturated from earlier storms this summer. This isn't happening in isolation either. Just days before the system arrived, historic flooding in West Virginia had already killed 2 people, and a fast-moving river in Ohio had claimed 5 lives after failed rescue attempts. Neither of those events is technically part of the next 10 days, but they're part of the same broader summer pattern, a season where the eastern half of the country keeps cycling between dangerous heat and sudden intense rainfall, sometimes within the same week. Layered right on top of the flooding threat is a separate hazard. A line of severe thunderstorms forecast to push from the Midwest into the east, carrying a real risk of damaging straight-line winds. This is the kind of system that doesn't always make national headlines the way a lines and localized destruction that can look, in the aftermath, almost indistinguishable from a small tornado even when no tornado touched down. The mechanism here is fairly straightforward. A pocket of unusually warm, humid air sitting over the eastern half of the country is colliding with a disturbance in the jet stream pushing in from the west. That collision is what's generating both the flooding rains up in New England and the line of severe storms tracking behind it. 2 different expressions of the same underlying atmospheric setup arriving in the same general window. Forecasters have flagged this severe weather threat as active into Tuesday specifically, meaning it isn't a one-day event. It's a multi-day corridor of risk moving progressively eastward as the week continues. It's worth understanding why this kind of severe weather corridor tends to underperform in public attention compared to how much actual damage it does. A single severe thunderstorm complex doesn't get a name, doesn't get a satellite loop broadcast on the evening news the way a hurricane does, and rarely triggers the kind of mandatory evacuation orders that make national headlines. But straight-line wind events like this one are collectively responsible for enormous amounts of the power outages and localized property damage that hit East Coast and Midwest communities every single summer, sometimes more, in aggregate, than a moderate hurricane season produces. The National Weather Service's Storm Prediction Center categorizes this kind of risk on its own multi-level scale, separate from hurricane categories entirely, precisely because the physics driving straight-line wind damage, rapidly descending, spreading columns of air called downbursts, are completely different from the physics of a rotating tropical system, even though the end result on the ground, a flattened tree line or a downed power grid, can look remarkably similar. Once the storm system clears, the next phase of this 10-day pattern is heat. And this is where the East Coast specifically comes into focus. The Weather Prediction Center's own short-range outlook already describes dangerous heat continuing across the south and expanding into the southwest, the Intermountain West, and the northern high plains as the week progresses. That's a west and south-leaning heat dome in the immediate term. But zoom out to NOAA's monthly outlook for the full month ahead, and the picture shifts noticeably eastward. The Climate Prediction Center's August temperature outlook shows a broad area of increased odds for above-average temperatures stretching from the southeast, through the mid-Atlantic and into parts of the northeast, with Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas showing the strongest signal of all. In plain terms, the immediate heat dome is currently centered over the west, but the East Coast's turn is baked into the broader monthly pattern, and it's specifically the southeast and mid-Atlantic, the same corridor already dealing with this week's storms and flooding that NOAA expects to run warmer than normal as August unfolds. This wouldn't be the East Coast's first serious heat event of the summer either. An earlier heat wave back in late June pushed heat index values as high as 115 degrees Fahrenheit from the Ohio Valley out to the coast, with cities like New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. all posting heat indexes above 100 degrees, and Amtrak was forced to run trains at reduced speeds along the Northeast Corridor because of it. If NOAA's August outlook holds, that won't be an isolated event this season. It'll be a pattern the East Coast keeps cycling back through. There's a reason this kind of setup, a hot, humid summer punctuated by repeated heat waves, tends to make the flooding and severe storm risk worse rather than simply adding a separate, unrelated hazard on top. Warmer air holds significantly more moisture than cooler air, which means that when a frontal disturbance does move through a hot, humid air mass like the one currently sitting over the east, it has considerably more fuel available to convert into heavy rainfall and strong thunderstorm updrafts than it would during a cooler, drier stretch of summer. That's part of why forecasters are treating this 10-day window as a connected sequence rather than 4 coincidentally timed hazards, the same warm, moisture-rich air mass that's setting up NOAA's above-normal Augusty. Heat outlook is also the air mass currently feeding the flooding and severe storms moving through right now. Now here's the piece of this story that ties directly back to that minimal notice warning at the top of this video, and it's the part with the most genuine uncertainty attached to it. The 2026 Atlantic hurricane season has been quiet by historical standards so far. NOAA's own preseason outlook gave a 55% chance of a below-normal season this year, largely because a strong El Niño pattern tends to generate wind shear that tears developing storms apart before they can organize. But below normal doesn't mean no impact. The season has already produced 2 named storms, Arthur and Bertha, and both of them brought direct impacts to the United States. Bertha made 2 separate Gulf Coast landfalls in Louisiana and Texas, bringing flooding and beach erosion before weakening. Even a quiet season, in other words, has already put actual storms on actual coastlines this year. Now attention has shifted to a specific patch of ocean, the waters surrounding Florida, the Carolinas, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Bermuda. AccuWeather's hurricane team has flagged this zone as the area with the best chance of producing some kind of tropical depression or tropical rainstorm over the next couple of weeks, running into the middle of August. The reasoning is specific and worth understanding because it's different from how most hurricanes form. A couple of weather fronts are expected to drop into this region and slowly decay over the coming days. If a cluster of thunderstorms tied to one of those decaying fronts manages to separate from it and organize around its own area of low pressure, it can develop a warm, uniform core and effectively convert from an ordinary frontal storm system into a tropical one. A completely different growth process than the long-track hurricanes that spin up off the African coast and cross the entire Atlantic. Sea surface temperatures in this zone are warm enough to support that kind of development, and wind shear. The disruptive, storm-tearing winds that have kept the Atlantic quiet most of this summer is expected to relax somewhat in this specific area for a period, compared to what's been in place for most of the prior weeks. This is exactly why AccuWeather's lead hurricane expert singled it out as a minimal notice zone. Because any system that forms this way develops close to shore, essentially in the backyard of the coastline it might affect, rather than tracking for a week or more across open ocean the way classic Cape Verde-type hurricanes do. There's no guarantee this becomes anything at all. A quick forming coastal system like this could just as easily fizzle into an unremarkable rain event. But if conditions do come together, coastal residents from Florida through the Carolinas could see far less lead time than they'd get from a storm that formed the traditional way, far out in the open Atlantic. It helps to understand why this particular stretch of ocean keeps coming up as the zone to watch, rather than somewhere else in the basin. Tropical development needs a few specific ingredients working together. Sufficiently warm water, typically above roughly 80 degrees Fahrenheit, relatively low wind shear, meaning winds at different altitudes aren't blowing in conflicting directions strongly enough to tear a developing storm apart, and some kind of triggering disturbance to get organized rotation started in the first place. Right now, the Caribbean itself is dealing with unusually high wind shear for this point in the season, a pattern strongly associated with El Niño years, which is actively suppressing development in that part of the basin. But the waters immediately around Florida, the Carolinas, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Bermuda represent a pocket of slightly lower pressure and slightly more favorable shear conditions, largely because of those decaying frontal systems expected to drop through the region. That's the entire reason forecasters keep pointing at this one specific patch of ocean, rather than treating the whole Atlantic as equally at risk. The ingredients for something to form are locally better there than almost anywhere else in the basin right now. Separately, there's also an important short-term thread already in motion. Remnants of the season's first storm, post-Tropical Arthur, have continued tracking northeastward after moving ashore near the Gulf Coast, bringing the potential for significant, even life-threatening flooding across eastern Louisiana before spreading into Georgia and the Carolinas. The National Hurricane Center has noted that environmental conditions could turn favorable for some renewed subtropical or tropical development once that system's remnant energy moves back offshore into the western Atlantic, though the odds of that specific redevelopment were assessed as low, in the range of roughly 10% over the following week at the time of that assessment. It's a storyline worth watching less because it's likely to become something dramatic, and more because it shows how directly this week's flooding, next week's tropical watch zone, and the broader 10-day pattern are all connected pieces of the same setup, rather than isolated coincidences. Step back and look at the full 10 days as one connected sequence rather than 4 separate headlines, and the shape of it becomes clear. It opens with flooding already in progress across parts of New England, layered on top of a summer that's already produced fatal flash flooding in West Virginia and Ohio. Behind that comes a multi-day corridor of severe thunderstorms sweeping from the Midwest into the east, carrying damaging wind risk into the first part of the week. Behind that comes an expanding heat pattern that NOAA's own monthly outlook says will likely tilt the southeast, mid-Atlantic, and northeast toward a warmer-than-normal August, echoing the extreme heat event the region already lived through in late June. And running underneath the entire window is a specific tropical watch zone off the southeastern coast. Not currently an imminent threat, but flagged by hurricane forecasters as worth close monitoring, precisely because any development there would come with unusually little warning. That's a genuinely full 10 days for the East Coast. Not one single dramatic event, but a stacked sequence of flooding, wind, heat, and a tropical wildcard, arriving back to back rather than spread out. A couple of clarifications matter here because forecast coverage like this tends to get flattened into scarier headlines than the underlying data actually supports. First, nothing described in this video is a confirmed named tropical storm bearing down on the coast. The southeast watch zone is exactly that. A zone being watched with formation odds that, where numbers have been given, sit in the range of 10 to 30% rather than anything close to certain. AccuWeather itself describes this as an area to monitor, not a storm to prepare for in the way you prepare for an approaching hurricane with a confirmed track. Second, a below-normal hurricane season forecast and the East Coast faces real risk this week are not contradictory statements, and it's worth being clear about why. A seasonal outlook describes the total number of storms expected across the entire 6-month Atlantic season. It says very little about whether any single one of those storms happens to form close to a populated coastline versus out in open ocean, where it poses no threat to land at all. This season is already a clear example of that distinction in action, a below-normal outlook, and yet 2 out of the season's first 2 named storms have already made direct landfall on the U.S. Gulf Coast. Third, the severe thunderstorm and flash flood threats moving through this week are a completely separate hazard category from the tropical watch zone, even though both are being discussed in the same 10-day window. Straight-line wind damage and flash flooding from a jet stream disturbance follow entirely different physics than a tropical system organizing over warm ocean water. Treating this as one single East Coast megastorm narrative would be inaccurate. It's several distinct, real hazards that happen to be arriving in close succession rather than one unified event. Here's the practical version, in order. Watch the New England flash flood situation over the next day or two. Moderate risk designations from the Weather Prediction Center are taken seriously precisely because they've historically correlated with genuinely dangerous, fast-developing flooding rather than routine heavy rain. Watch the severe storm corridor as it pushes from the Midwest into the east through the early part of the week, particularly for damaging wind reports and localized power outages in major metro areas. Watch NOAA's temperature outlook translate into practice as the week progresses. If the southeast and mid-Atlantic start trending toward the above-normal heat the Climate Prediction Center is forecasting for August, expect heat advisories to follow the same corridor that's dealing with this week's storms. And watch the waters off Florida, the Carolinas, Cuba, the Bahamas, and Bermuda through the first half of August. Not because something is guaranteed to develop there, but because forecasters have specifically flagged it as the one spot in the Atlantic basin where a fast, low-notice system is most plausible right now. None of this adds up to a single catastrophic event. It adds up to something arguably more relevant to how most people actually experience severe weather. A genuinely busy, back-to-back stretch where flooding, wind, heat, and a tropical wildcard are all sitting in the same 10-day window, each with its own timeline, each worth tracking on its own terms, rather than lumping into one vague sense of dread. Stay with your local National Weather Service office for the specific alerts that apply to where you live, because the details in a pattern like this one shift fast. And we'll keep tracking every update as this window plays out.